Hi everyone, this is Mr. Fukowski, and I'm going to try to give you a 15-minute review recap based on political opinion as well as political action. So again, when we talk about political culture, it's the way in which a specific country typically thinks about politics and economic life. So for example, Americans generally believe more in political equality than economic. So compare that to Europe, which is more about, you'll see more socialistic programs such as universal health care or providing tuition for free for certain colleges. You don't really see that in the United States at all. But the elements you do see here listed, of course, are embedded into elements of American society. These are part of our political culture. And again, noticeably absent is economic equality. And again, you just see it here in this chart where most Americans say that it's not the government's responsibility to take care of the poor, whereas 62% say it is. In terms of measuring public opinion, we do that through polls. And really, since 1964, trust in government has declined. Remember, that's around the time in which the Vietnam War was going on. You have the Watergate scandal eventually coming about. And since this point, trust basically erodes. And today, more than two-thirds of Americans distrust their government. But sometimes there are certain events, such as September 11th, which will increase trust. However, only for a brief amount of time. It has since declined. And you see that the public trust of the government has significantly declined as most people do not trust it, and that has significantly increased over time. And again, we've talked about things like Watergate along with Bill Clinton's impeachment trial. So all this stuff has culminated with the mistrust of government. But today, interestingly enough, many people actually have no specific opinion about the scope of government. And unfortunately, a lot of people do not know a lot about the candidates in terms of their policies that they support. They're more about performance. So during debates, they might see, oh, you performed well, or you look very sharp. So really, if you're a politician, you should, of course, be concerned about policy, but I think as equally as important, if not more important, unfortunately, you have to maintain a really good exterior. And really the disengagement of college students, which around 60% in 1966 were involved in some way, keeping up to date with political affairs, that has significantly declined. It has upticked just a little bit, but 37% is nowhere near the 60% that we saw during the Vietnam era. So certainly disengagement amongst younger people has declined. And we also see in 1964, younger people were more likely to be more informed and have a greater amount of political knowledge than older people, yet you see the opposite has happened in 2004. As the older you get, the more political knowledge you have as opposed to back in the 1960s. So things are rapidly changing. So, where do you stand on certain issues? Well, this all deals with political socialization, how you were brought up, in which you acquire your political orientation. Why are you liberal? Why are you conservative? Why are you nothing, right? This is all typically done informally. You pick it up, you absorb, you acquire from family members, which is the biggest impact for children, along with the media. So if both of your parents are Democratic, you have a 59% chance, essentially, of being Democratic. If your parents are both independent, most likely you will be an independent, or if your parents are both Republican, you're most likely to be a Republican yourself. So think about how that is true for most of you. In terms of also how we learn about politics and what's going on, well, the media is the chief source of information as children age, and we see a major generational gap. Typically, the older you are, the more likely you are to be watching television news as opposed to younger people, and we call the media linkage institutions. Schools are also important because they help socialize young people into political culture, the importance of civics, and as we know that the better educated citizens are much more likely to vote as opposed to people who do not have that education. There is a liberalizing effect of college that it might not necessarily make you a liberal, but you might make you much more liberal towards certain areas such as social issues or economic issues. Not necessarily that if you're conservative, you're automatically going to become liberal, but you'll probably become less conservative, according to studies performed. But as you age, your political participation typically increases, and your party attachment and your ideology grows much firmer. So we do have political ideologies. These are your set of beliefs about politics, The liberals, well, there's about 24% of Americans are liberals, while the dominant one is conservatives. Then right around the same amount are moderates. So really, if you're a politician, you know that if you're conservative, you have a solid conservative base, but it's really this 38% that's up for grab. Of course, there are things that influence things. Gender gap, women tend to be less conservative. There was also a number of different factors as well, which we'll get into soon. Liberals versus conservatives, well, you see it here. Typically, conservatives are tough on crime. They want more freedom economically, while they want the government to step in on social issues such as outlawing gay marriage or outlawing things like abortion, whereas liberals are more about more government regulation on the economy, more taxes, while liberals typically want less government restriction in areas of social issues such as abortion and gay marriage. But things that ultimately affect political socialization, political events, religion, occupation, absolutely. For example, Catholics and Jews tend to be more liberal than, let's say, Protestants and evangelicals. Professors and lawyers tend to be actually more liberal compared to if you work in the construction, oil industry, you see there. Even depending on where you live can impact whether or not you are a Democrat or a Republican, or should I say liberal or conservative ideology. And then upper class tends to vote Republican. Middle class can be split. It's susceptible to other influences as well. Working class tends to vote Democrat, but again, they are subject to other factors as well. In terms of minority voters, blacks are much more likely to vote Democratic, especially since the 1964 elections. Hispanics also tend to vote more Democratic because Democrats tend to favor pro-immigration policies. Asians tend to be more conservative based on their culture. And of course, the more educated you are, some studies do show this, especially if you go into grad school and you graduate from grad school, you'll tend to be more liberal. Women, again, tend to be more liberal, men more conservative. The more wealthier you are, the more likely you are to be a conservative. And we've stated all of this as well. Other ideologies, libertarians, they support individual liberties and strict limitations on government. They want as little government in their life, economically and socially, as possible. Whereas socialists, they want the government to be heavily involved regulating economics, especially economics. So if you think about countries today, like France with universal health care, and they might pay for you going to doctor's visits, that's a socialistic policy. So you support greater equality, especially in economics. But really the defining issues for these ideologies come down to civil rights, economics, and public and personal issues. These are the three major defining issues. As to where you stand on this will typically determine your ideology. So we have different types of voters, everything from ideologues down to no-issue content voters. Typically the major ones are the group benefit voters, based on how did you serve my needs. I'm let's for example say a farmer. How did you impact my life with legislation? So the vast majority of people are group benefits voters. Political participation, well, the number one is voting in elections. Your book also does mention that watching the television campaign on television is conventional participation. I guess you could put that as well. Other types of conventional participation involve contacting elected officials, working in campaigns, things like that. But we also have unconventional protests and participation. So we have civil disobedience. Think about Martin Luther King Jr. protesting, filing lawsuits, but you don't typically see that as often. And just to go back to this last part, class inequality and participation, the more money you have, the more likely you are to participate in politics because you're affected more, or at least you think you are. In terms of the elite, well, they espouse either a purely liberal or conservative ideology. If typically they are an activist, they have more access to the media. Think of Michael Moore. There are many elite groups, but they are not necessarily unified because they typically espouse one part of an ideology or one specific issue. So public opinion, well, is very important because it determines the population's belief on a number of different things. It's important that with polls, especially in the United States, that you are able to get a representative sample because we have many different races, ethnicities. So as Americans get older, it's important they are in the sample. Also, as we have more Hispanics growing, that they are represented as well. So be aware of things that have affected these segments of the population because it does impact their opinion on several matters. And as I mentioned before, the graying of America, Social Security. If you're a politician, you're really going to care about Social Security because you want those people's votes, especially those senior citizens. Okay, moving on. How do we measure it? Well, we want a sample size typically of 1,500 to 2,000 to have a margin of error, as we talked about, plus or minus 5%. Random sampling is important as well. That is particularly crucial. How do you get a random sample? Well, it's mostly done with random digit dialing via the telephone. Power of words, very important. How you word things. You don't want to be biased because you don't want to influence people's opinion. So, for example, if you say, "Are you in favor of killing babies?" Well, that's very biased, of course. You would want to phrase it in a more neutral manner. But polls are important. They help politicians detect public preferences. But, some say, you shouldn't do what the people think. You should stick firmly to your ideology. But those are many different points on that. Exit polls are used by the media to predict election day winners, although the main drawback is that they could discourage people from voting, as we saw in the 2000 election. Other effects, bandwagon effect, people jump on board. Instead of doing what's right, they go with what's popular, not sticking to their guns. So again, polls can be helpful, but also they can, have their drawbacks, as we just mentioned. Suffrage. Well, many people have been denied the right to vote, and over time, we've become more democratic. 15th Amendment, allowing African Americans to vote, but then that was thwarted, meaning stopped by poll taxes, literacy tests, and it's the Voting Rights Act that gets rid of that and allows African Americans to vote. But the voter ID law is only legal because the Supreme Court recently struck down the Voting Rights Act. So that's made things like showing your voter ID, which some people have claimed prevents minorities from voting. Women have gotten the right to vote, 19th Amendment, in the year 1920, and then people who are 18 years of age through the 26th Amendment. Political efficacy. If you think that your political participation really matters, well, then you're probably going to vote. If you don't think, you're probably not going to. Ballot fatigue. Some people only vote for a couple races because they say, "Oh, I don't know anyone else. I get too tired, not going to fill it out." Civic duty. Some people vote, say, "Hey, this is my role as a citizen in a democratic republic to vote." Makes sense. And you see turnout rate is amongst highest of 65 and over. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to come out. Whites as a whole turn out higher, but when we control economics between whites and minorities actually are higher. Women are slightly higher, married likely much higher, and union higher as well. Voter registration is important as well. 2/3 of the voting age population is registered. Doesn't mean we all vote. And one way to get out the vote more was the Motor Voter Act, or the National Registration Act of 1993, which allows you to basically register to vote while applying for a driver's license. But that didn't really increase. There was an initial surge, but it really didn't increase turnout during the elections. Education, more education, you're more likely to vote. The more partisan you are, meaning the more you favor one party, the more likely you are to vote. Older, right? And then we said with Caucasians, more likely to vote, but one, compare education and socioeconomics, you are going to see more other ethnicities voting at a higher rate. So who votes? We already covered that before. And we talked about voter registration. States that have same-day registration are higher than states that don't. But some people don't because of, let's say, for example, apathy. They don't care. So that's a major obstacle. Extension of suffrage has been denied over time. Now everyone has the right to vote, but again, that's taken time to occur. And it's only really a recent phenomenon in the past 100 years. Really, women haven't even had the right to vote for over 100 years. Political parties also have weakened over time, so they don't have as much of a base. Major reasons why people don't vote. Top one, too busy. I guess a lot of people are busy on Tuesdays. Mandate theory of election real quickly. The idea that winning candidate has a mandate from the people to carry out his or her platform or politics, so they think that gives them sort of permission to do what they want. Of course, political scientists are not keen on that either. Typically, people vote, unfortunately, for candidates based on their image rather than their policies. So it's not a lot of policy voting, and that's really unfortunate. The media is to blame for that to some extent because they focus on the horse race and not necessarily the main issues. And sometimes they're not even forced to take a stand either. And the last thing I'm going to end with is retrospective voting. Voting cast a vote based on what a candidate has done for them lately, sort of like a group's benefit vote. Hope that helps.